Okay, members, let's try this again. It sounds better, although that last explosion of sound was notable. Was that to just get our attention?
No.
All right. For folks watching this on a simulcast, our apologies with the sound system in the building. Hopefully now it's a little bit better. And Dr. Goodwin, if you would go ahead with your report, please. File item number 7.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that working for the folks? Perfect.
Great.
And no echo. Well, thanks for the folks for fixing that so quickly. That was impressive. I've been mentioning the American Geophysical Union. December meeting was held in San Francisco last week. This is a meeting that's held every year at that time. And for those of you, they did a very good press coverage, but there's something over 22,000 people attend that conference from all over the world. And what was particularly interesting is, I think, the very high profile of much of the Bay Delta science that was presented in those sessions. The first item that's on the lead scientist report here is that yesterday the latest issue of the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science online journal was issued. The link is there. And I think that this issue again shows the dedication and interest of Dr. Sam Luomo, the editor, in going out and seeking papers that have a very great contemporary importance and significance. So there's 3 papers that appear here. The first one is an article by Dr. Bill Fleener and Dr. Fabienne Bobardelli from UC Davis. And what they've done is to develop a simplified 1D model that allows very rapid assessments to be done to evaluate the effects of sea level rise and diversion. So it's a simple screening tool so that we don't need to get into these very complex 3D models. So that's a tool I think we're going to be seeing used a lot in the future. The second paper is by Dr. Wim Kimmerer and others at San Francisco State University that linked one of these complex 3D models, the TRIM code, to looking at the effects of low salinity zone, particularly how that can be used as a surrogate for fish habitat, which is, of course, a very a topic that's receiving a lot of debate right now. And so the paper goes into a lot of detail about the extent of which salinity can be used and some of the inconsistencies that just by using a very simple approach. And their conclusion is that there are other controlling influences that also should be considered. The third paper is given by Dr. Michael Moore and Dr. William Satterthwaite, who are with the NIMS Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Santa Cruz and UC Santa Cruz, respectively. And this paper was looking particularly at the accuracy of some of the techniques which are used to determine returning salmon and the salmon counts. So one of the technologies that are used is to go out and count carcasses. And in particular, they were looking at the technologies that are used to do that. Was there a difference between fresh carcasses and carcasses that have been out there for a long time? Because there's a general degradation in the technologies that are used over time. So this paper actually comes out with some very useful recommendations that I think we'll see involved into protocols for that particular technique, or certainly will be considered by agencies in the coming months. So that's the online journal. The second issue here is about the BDCP review, which of course you're tasked to do in the first part of 2014. And if you recall, part of the information we're developing for you to make your various assessments is by having an independent panel to look at the effects analysis review. So this panel, this is the third phase of the review process. And yesterday, there was both a webcast and a live meeting that many folks attended. The purpose of that meeting was to have ICF and the BDCP team explain to the review panel where to look in this massive document. And we felt that particularly the consulting team did a really nice job in highlighting the issues that the review panel had raised in their previous review and how that had been addressed. And so the idea of this was to go through, here was your comment, this is where you look in the report and the documentation. And the panel actually responded to that very positively. Yes, Judge.
Peter, how was that panel selected?
Okay, that's a very good question. So the panel has actually been the same throughout this process. And eventually, the final decision is made by the lead scientist. But there are planning committees that put together this type of review group, and those planning groups usually have very broad representation. So the group will put together names and make recommendations for the various areas. The science program staff then do a vetting of many of those nominations where we look for balance on the committee. We look to make sure all of the relative disciplines are met. And also we look for a broad range of experience on the committee. So we don't want everyone just working for the National Science Foundation. We don't want people just working for funded through public utilities or NGOs. So what you'll see is this independent panel is selected to be just that. Another criteria which we use is that we try and maintain a balance just in the same way that we have on the ISB, that you need some very in-depth local knowledge of what's going on. But the balance of people on the panel will be from outside. So that the idea is that the panel is very well informed by people who knows what's going on, but also we have internationally and nationally recognized experts from the outside.
How do they relate to the ISB, or do they?
They don't at all.
Independent, completely.
Totally separate. So the ISB will give you yet another independent assessment of what's going on. The ISB will take this independent panel's review into their assessment and their report, which will come to you.
How well known is this, Phil, in terms of, there's a couple layers of scientific analysis here that I don't know if the public is aware of that or not.
Well, there is material available on our website on this process. The use of independent peer panels is one that's been ongoing. It was done in Cal-Fed Bay Delta long before we were formed, and we've continued it. And Peter, remind me again, I think we've done 5, 6, 7 independent peer panels over the last 3.5 years. Is that number even close? That's my recollection. Whether it's at the request of the Water Board or DWR or BDCP or federal agencies, those requests come in to create an independent peer panel for specific focused issues. Like the report you're talking about today, the long-term biological reports, is a federal request. Is my recollection. That's
correct, and that's the 4th annual review we've done for the federal agencies.
And Frank, I think the answer to the question is everybody likes the idea of independent panel review, but it's no secret that everybody also wants to have their friends on the panel. So the art form is to do it in a way that reserves that decision for the lead scientist. That was a practice that was done under Cal-Fed Bay Delta, is my recollection, and we've simply carried that forward. I'm trying to remember, but in 2010 or so, we formed our first panel. I don't remember what the subject was. There was a certain amount of commotion, and we then announced, well, if you have candidates to submit, just send us the names, and the lead scientist, then a guy named Cliff Dahm, would consider those names. And we've continued that practice. I don't recall any great controversy about the process of forming them to date, but there's always controversy about what findings they make.
How about the IRP as opposed to this panel? I mean, the panel we just discussed. Are they part of the ISB, the IRP?
No, they're entirely independent. So this is an independent review panel.
Pardon?
So no, this is an IRP, an independent review panel, so it's entirely independent of the ISB. Typically, the ISB have this 30,000-foot level of what's going
So
on.
there's three panels then, as it were. There's a board, there's a panel, and there's review panel, and then there's these folks here that you just talked about. Did I get that right? There's the BDCP review panel,
That's correct.
and then there's the independent review panel.
Absolutely.
Are
Yep.
they looking at some of the same issues?
No, they're for slightly different purposes.
Okay,
So
maybe one understands it but me, so
okay.
don't bother with me right now. I'll ask you-
But let me just capture that for you. So the ISB has the responsibility of broadly
Right,
looking
I get
across
that.
science and adaptive management. These are focused panels, usually when we're asked to do an independent review on behalf of a state or federal agency or other entity.
And you're generally in charge of the selection of those panels.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
And perhaps I could just add a note to that. If you recall, the Stewardship Council, right at the start of the science plan, you had asked us to revisit the guidelines of how we put panels together and
Right.
for workshops. And so that's been discussed very extensively amongst the science community, and the update of our procedures are reflected in the science plan that you received and you accepted. Was that the last meeting or the meeting before? So they have been updated in 2013. But I'd be happy to just
Well,
Do they advise other agencies aside from us?
yeah, independent review panels are not unknown. As a matter of fact, they're relatively and increasingly more common in both federal and state activity. Just a note, in the 2009 legislation, Water Code Section 85280 was adopted, and that gave specific statutory recognition to the Delta Independent Science Board and the Delta Science Program. And I thought I'd remembered it correctly, but under some of the language, it includes the mission of the Delta Science Program shall be to provide the best possible unbiased scientific information. That mission shall be carried out through funding research, synthesizing and communicating scientific information to policymakers, decision makers, promoting independent scientific peer review. And that's really under the nomenclature we're doing this. And I can't remember, but I think it's exhibit or attachment A or B or C to the Delta Science Program is the refined version of earlier policies you've adopted on developing the independent peer review panel, which also has a conflict of interest provision in it too, which is pretty good.
Right.
Yeah.
So the organizing panels committees that will put together these, you and myself, we really agonize over that committee membership. We don't take it lightly at all, because as you pointed out, getting the right people at the table to give a balanced, unbiased opinion is extremely important. So that meeting occurred yesterday. For those of you who weren't able to connect with it, it is available online, so you can go back and pick it up if it will help some of your assessments in the coming weeks.
Peter, I just had a chance to look briefly at it last night. Have you had a chance to review it yet?
Which one's this, the effects?
Yes. I'm talking about the LOBO, the long-term operations biological opinion. Are you at that one yet?
That's the third. I hadn't quite got there yet.
Sorry.
It's, so anyway, I just wanted to let you know that was available. The other thing actually is part of the science plan that we've discussed a lot with the various agencies is how can we make these review panels most effective. And so we've spoken to people who've been on the panels as well as the agencies themselves. And so particularly with the State Water Resources Control Board workshops, which we'll be holding in February, you're going to see a slightly different format. You're a lot more preparation for the panel coming in so they're better prepared to ask more in-depth questions and to get to those issues. The last point I just wanted to make about the BDCP effects analysis is that we're also very pleased to see the ISB actually sent along a couple of members to be in the audience and to listen to the process. So obviously they're going to be tracking that panel very closely as well. Now just to jump over to the Lobo review in answer to the Chair's comments. I haven't taken a close look at that.
That was on your desk as you walked in this morning.
But just a couple of comments I wanted to make from the executive summary. I thought it was very interesting that the review panel actually commented about the opportunity provided in 2013. This is a drought year. It's not just looking at more water in the system, but also looking at the effects of drought as well. And this panel was very, very specific in their recommendations, and just some feedback we got orally from the affected federal agencies. They said that they found this report very constructive. On the side of the panel, I'd just like to quote one comment here. The IRP was encouraged by the continued movement towards research aimed specifically at linking the survival and behavior of fishes to water operations on the Sacramento River, as well as the Delta pumping facilities. So they felt that the research, the science that was being done was getting much more targeted towards the questions that were out there. But Chair Eisenberg, you had a comment. I'm not sure I could respond immediately, but... Well,
I zipped through it, and at some point, I'd like to know your conclusions about the report. This is the fourth one we've done, or fifth?
Fourth, yeah.
And presumptively, we're going to be doing annual reports for a while. This is the kind of review that it will become, I think, increasingly more common. And interestingly enough, the same day we got a copy of it yesterday, the DWR released its State Water Project Reliability Report, the 2013 Reliability Report. And, looking at them in tandem, it's just very clear to me, our water supply is increasingly erratic because of climate changes, but also it's relatively finite. The demands seem to be always increasing. So the reliability, according to DWR, is declining. No surprise, they've done 5 other reports on the same subject, declining over time. This seems to fit into the discussion, and I was particularly taken with the fact that they picked up the notion of studying pulsing of flows, which is one of the recommendations strongly from the Delta Science Program that we put in the Delta Plan. And when you take a look at it, could you take a look at that pulsing recommendation? It starts appearing on page 19, the first flush, they call it. The first flush for Delta smelt.
Okay, we'll certainly take a look at that and report back to you. And of course that links very closely to several of the activities which we have going in 2013. So maybe I'll cross-reference that to when we get to describing some of the things that have happened in this past year. The other thing which the Council might also be interested to know is in that preliminary feedback we got from National Marine Fisheries, they actually commented on how useful the comments have made, not just from this year, but from previously. And so one of the things they're thinking about is how can they start conducting synthesis activities, particularly to pick up on the recommendations of these science panels. And so they have a couple of ideas that probably by January we'll have a better idea of. But it gets right to the heart of what the National Academies, the ISB, have been talking about is needed here through the science program and others, is this effective synthesis, particularly on the basis of these science panels recommendations. It just doesn't sit there on a web page somewhere and there's no action. Certainly NIMS, Fish and Wildlife Service, have been very active, I think, in how they've responded to the recommendations.